This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can visit their store by using my referral link in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Neat Sahone, and it's Wednesday. And that means it's time for another episode of Deck History, a series where I discuss prominent Magic deck archetypes and trace their history from their origins all the way through to today. As usual, a poll determined the topic of this video. Last week's poll pitted two tribal decks against each other, Spirits and Slivers came out on top. A tribal deck is generally one that is focused on one particular creature type and takes advantage of various payoffs for that creature type. Slivers are unique in that almost all of them offer some sort of tribal bonus. This makes them really snowball, as every new Sliver you play tends to do something that makes all of your Slivers better. Slivers originally made their debut in Tempest Block, which had sets come out between 1997 and 1998. Ever since then, they have been one of Magic's most beloved tribes, and they've made their return in a few sets since then. Slivers don't have as long and varied of a competitive history as some of the other tribes, as they haven't really had the kind of sustained success that tribes like Goblins, Elves, or even Spirits have had. However, they have had multi-format success, even if it has been fairly sporadic. In this video, we'll talk about Sliver decks in Time Spiral Block Constructed, Extended, Modern, Legacy, and Pauper. Because Sliver decks never found any success in Standard or Tempest Block Constructed, we're going to start with a look at Extended, as that would be the first format to feature competitive Sliver decks, which emerged there in 1999. Extended is a now-defunct rotating format that featured the last several years' worth of sets. Christian Gregorich became the first player to ever top 8 a major event with a Sliver deck at Grand Prix Vienna in 1999. His deck, called Counter Sliver, wasn't just a mindless aggro deck. Don't get me wrong, it did run 20 creatures, including plenty of Slivers, but the deck also packed in an impressive suite of counter magic, with the deck really playing more like an aggro control or tempo deck. The game plan was largely to get your Slivers out on the board to pressure your opponent, and then use your counter magic to disrupt them and keep them from stopping your Sliver onslaught. Even without counter magic to protect them, the Slivers in this deck were a pain to deal with. Crystalline Sliver offered Shroud, while Hibernation Sliver allowed you to return Slivers to your hand for no mana at all. This deck ran a single Worship to take advantage of how difficult it was to remove these Slivers, as if it was in play, it was often impossible for your opponent to ever do lethal damage to you. The more aggressive Slivers in the deck were Muscle Sliver, which offered +1/+1 to all of your Slivers, and Winged Sliver, which sent them into the air, enabling them to attack effectively on most board states. This aggro control Sliver build would be one that continued to find some success in Extended in 1999, including at Worlds that year, and later at Pro Tour Chicago. The deck at Pro Tour Chicago had one big difference from the Christian Gregorich version, so let's take a look at that deck, which Christian Lurs top 8'd the event with. This version of the deck goes full on 5 colors and uses Demonic Consultation so that the deck can tutor up whichever Sliver would be helpful in a given situation. If you really needed to get some protection against a board sweeper, you could grab your Hibernation Sliver, or if you really just needed flying to swing for lethal, you could go with Winged Sliver. This was obviously a big deal, as it made the deck a lot more consistent. He also used one Sliver that wasn't in the earlier decks, Acidic Sliver, which lets you pay 2 mana and sacrifice Slivers to do 2 damage to any target. This could provide you with the last few points of damage and was also a nice one to tutor up. While Sliver decks continued to be played and extended into 2000, they never really attained the same level of success they had in 1999, and before long the deck rotated out of Extended anyway, and Sliver decks would never return to the Extended format before it ended in 2011. This was true even though a bunch of new Slivers got printed in Onslaught Block between 2002 and 2003. New life would eventually come to Slivers in competitive Magic though, and it was a result of another block featuring them, Time Spiral. The 3 sets in this block were released between 2006 and 2007. One Sliver deck top 8'd Grand Prix Montreal, a block Grand Prix in 2007. This deck, piloted by Guillaume Wafo-Tapa, doesn't actually have Sliver in its name, instead it was just called Wild Pair, and that's because the deck's main game plan was to combo off with that card, but as you can see from the deck list, Slivers are very much central to the deck's combo. If you have Wild Pair in play and you play a creature, you get to search your library for a creature with the same total power and toughness and put it into play. The deck consists almost entirely of 1/1s and 2/2s, so they all tutored stuff up for you directly to the battlefield. Used correctly, this could let you really rip through your entire deck and win the game. The deck's main combo pieces were of course Wild Pair, along with Dormant Sliver, Reflex Sliver, and Gemhide Sliver. Getting those slivers into play was much easier thanks to Wild Pair, and once you had those 3 slivers and the enchantment in play, you would be drawing tons of extra cards since every sliver that you played would trigger Dormant Sliver, including those that came into play from Wild Pair. Because you had Gemhide Sliver and Reflex Sliver in play, all of your slivers would produce mana right away, letting you play more slivers, which in turn drew you more slivers. Eventually, you would need Frenetic Sliver so that you could get rid of the Dormant Sliver, at which point you could swing for lethal with your Sliver army. Frenetic Sliver also allowed you to protect your combo pieces while you were setting up. You basically just drew your entire deck and had a board filled with slivers who would be able to swing for lethal. One nice thing about the deck was that it wasn't necessarily all in on the combo. It could also just win with some sliver aggro, but the combo kill gave it the ability to just win the game out of nowhere. As is usually the case, Block Constructed is a very short-lived format, and there were not very many other events in Time Spiral Block Constructed, and that meant the end of Block Slivers. So far, we've seen 2 kinds of sliver decks that were far from mindless aggro decks. After all, we've seen both aggro control and combo slivers. However, from here on out, the sliver decks we talk about in Modern, Legacy, and Pauper are largely going to be more what you think of when you hear sliver deck. However, it would once again be a very long time until slivers became relevant in any format again. In fact, there was almost a decade between sliver decks top-8ing major events. Let's take a look at Legacy now, since that would be the next format to prominently feature a sliver deck, which first started to show up there in 2016. This sliver deck was in the Bant colors and it ran several slivers we've already met, like Crystalline Sliver, Hibernation Sliver, and Muscle Sliver, but there are also some newcomers. One of these was Gale Rider's Sliver. Magic 2014 and Magic 2015 introduced some new slivers, including the Gale Rider, and this gave sliver decks access to a sliver that only costs a single blue mana and grants them all flying, which was largely an upgrade from the earlier Winged Sliver. One thing of note about slivers from Magic 2014 onward, they are no longer symmetrical, as earlier slivers were. Instead, they only buff your slivers. One other really nice thing was that by this point there were 3 2-mana slivers that gave +1/+1 to all of your slivers. Alongside Muscle Sliver, you also now had Predatory and Sinew Sliver, so your board was frequently quite large. Another nice tool for slivers was Ether Vial, which gave the deck a way to put slivers into play at instant speed, while also generally saving you a ton of mana. Almost all of the slivers in this deck cost 2 mana too, so it was a great deck for Ether Vial. The deck even featured a land that was a sliver too, Mutavault, which could be pretty scary in the deck. After this top 8 though, slivers went dormant in Legacy for a while. However, some more new slivers were printed in 2019's Modern Horizons, and this actually led to a pretty significant resurgence for the deck, at least compared to what it was doing before. Daniel Nunes top-8'd a Magic Online Legacy Challenge with a sliver deck featuring a couple of these new slivers in 2020. In particular, he used Cloud Shredder Sliver and Unsettled Mariner. Obviously, the Mariner doesn't have Sliver in its name, but because it's a changeling, it gets all the buffs from your slivers, and it also has a nice ability that counters any spell that targets your permanents, unless your opponent pays an additional 1 mana. Meanwhile, Cloud Shredder Sliver gave flying and haste, and this really accelerated how quickly you could do damage. Since 2020, sliver decks have operated on the margins of Legacy without any other major top 8s, so it is worth noting that even with the new Modern Horizon slivers, the deck isn't really a consistent player in the format. Let's move now to Modern, where sliver decks first began to find success in 2017. Julian Brandmeier top-8'd a Magic Online Modern Challenge using slivers that year. This deck looks markedly different from what we've seen so far, largely because Modern only features cards from 8th edition forward, which means none of the Tempest slivers can be in the deck. So, if you wanted to play slivers in Modern back in 2017, you were mostly relying on slivers from Time Spiral Block and Magic 2014 and 2015. This included cards like Blur Sliver, which granted haste, Diffusion Sliver, which made your opponent pay extra mana to target your slivers, and Mana Weft Sliver, which let you tap slivers for mana of any color. The deck also used one really notable Time Spiral sliver earlier decks didn't use, Sedge Sliver, which would generally give +1/+1 to your whole board and allow your slivers to regenerate. As you can see, this version of the deck is really all in on slivers. In fact, it has a whopping 33 of them. The only 2 non-lands in the deck that aren't slivers are cards that help you put slivers into play really efficiently, Collected Company and Ether Vial. Company was a pretty sweet card for the deck because it gave you a second way to put slivers into play at instant speed, but it also gave you a toolbox-like effect much of the time, where you really got to select a couple of slivers from a wider selection of them, and you could choose the best ones to put into play in a given situation. Company is a big reason why the deck is so creature heavy with those 33 creatures, since the card gets more likely to give you 2 creatures if you run a ton of them, and it also gets better the more potential options it gives you. By now, there was also a pretty nice Sliver land in Sliver Hive, which was great for your mana and could even crank out slivers in the later game. As in Legacy, slivers haven't exactly been a regular presence in Modern, but they did get an upgrade thanks to Modern Horizons, and if we look at a deck that top-8'd a Magic Online Modern Challenge in 2020, you can see the ways in which these new slivers have impacted the deck. Just like we saw in Legacy, both Cloud Shredder Sliver and Unsettled Mariner were featured in the new version of slivers, but one more Modern Horizons sliver made it into this modern version of the deck. This was Dregscape Sliver, which gives all of your slivers unearthed, and that's pretty sweet because it gives you a source of more damage out of the graveyard, and because most slivers grant some bonus to all of your other slivers, it was usually more meaningful than just some random 2/2 coming back. This version of the deck also goes a lot harder into 5 colors, and it can support this bold strategy thanks not only to Sliver Hive, but also Ancient Ziggurat, Cavern of Souls, and Unclaimed Territory. This gave the deck excellent mana. However, that pretty much ends the story of slivers in Modern. Like in Legacy, they show up at events from time to time, but they don't show up at every event, and they definitely don't do well at events regularly. However, we do still have one more format to look at, and it is the format where slivers have found the most consistent success: Pauper. Pauper is a format where only cards that have been printed at common rarity at least once are legal. This results in a very different metagame, and it makes sense that slivers would do well there, as many nice slivers have been printed at common over the years. Pauper became an officially sanctioned format in 2017, and in 2018, the first Sliver deck top-8'd a Magic Online Pauper Challenge. So let's take a look at that deck. This Sliver deck doesn't have the luxury of playing a bunch of multicolored lands, and as a result, it's really only a 2-color deck, but there are plenty of really nice slivers at common in green and white. So the deck still turns out to be pretty good. At the core of the deck are the same 3 slivers that we saw in Legacy that pump your whole board. Like in that format, Pauper Sliver decks get to run 3 slivers that give +1/+1 to the board in Muscle Sliver, Sinew Sliver, and Predatory Sliver. The deck also features Plated Sliver, which boosts toughness, and Sidewinder Sliver, which gives all of your slivers flanking. As we've seen in many of the Sliver decks we've looked at so far, this version also uses some card selection to help you find just the right sliver. In this case, Adventurous Impulse and Commune with Nature. From 2018 on, Sliver decks have actually been featured pretty regularly at Pauper events, and in 2020 the deck underwent some significant change. This was partly the result of the slivers that were printed in Modern Horizons, but there are also a couple of other cards that helped improve the deck. The only Modern Horizons sliver to make this deck was Bladeback Sliver, which gives you a source of some serious damage once you run out of gas. The deck also runs some other interesting slivers from older sets that we haven't talked about yet, like Virulent Sliver, which gives all of your slivers Poisonous 1, which means you can actually win with poison counters. The other newer cards in the deck are this deck's card selection sorceries, which are Lead the Stampede, which was printed at Common and Iconic Masters, and Winding Way from Modern Horizons. The deck is dense enough with creatures that both of these are very capable of drawing you multiple cards, which is great. Sliver decks are still a factor in Pauper today, and it is certainly the format where you're the most likely to see a Sliver deck. And that's true today, but also historically, as Sliver success in other formats has, as we've seen, been quite sporadic. So, that's the history of Sliver decks. If you want to have a say in next week's topic, don't forget to vote in the poll on the Community tab. If you enjoyed this video, like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you catch future videos, subscribe and turn on notifications so you can stay aware of future episodes of Deck History. If you need to catch up on the past episodes, and there are more than 30, you should see the playlist on your screen shortly. Lastly, if you want to go the extra mile in supporting the channel, you can do that on Patreon. Thanks for watching.